There are many more affidavits here. I'd like to read them all to you, but I don't have the time. You should have had the time and energy to go look for them. That's your job. Like it's my job to defend the president and to represent the president. It's your job to read these things and not falsely report that there's no evidence. Do you know how many affidavits we have in the Michigan case? 220 affidavits. They're not all public, but 8 of them are. 4 affiants here, those are people who give affidavits, report an incident that under any other circumstances would have been on the front page of all your newspapers if it didn't involve the hatred that you have, irrational, pathological hatred that you have for the president.
Well, that was Rudy Giuliani just tearing a strip off journalists in the United States, very vigorously saying not only does voting fraud exist, but shame on journalists for not making inquiries themselves. It's a good point. Voting fraud, Russian collusion was the only thing we heard from the media party for the first 3 years trying to delegitimize Trump's election. When we have genuine problems in key states, battleground states this time, though, the media couldn't be hastier in their unanimous view that Joe Biden must be crowned the president right away. In that press conference, there was also a lawyer named Sidney Powell who made more dramatic allegations about a foreign internet conspiracy, I suppose, to literally revise and undo votes electronically. A spectacular claim that has yet to be proved, but some would say you save your evidence for the court of law, not for press conferences. Joining us to help digest this huge story is our friend Joel Pollak, Senior Editor-at-Large at Breitbart.com. Joel, great to see you again. There were a lot of workaday allegations, like regular election fraud allegations in the press conference. What Sidney Powell talked about, this Venezuelan company changing millions of votes, I've never heard anything so spectacular like that in my life, and it makes me nervous when I hear something that spectacular because it's almost like I want it to be true to explain this election loss, but it feels like it's too far. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think she's operating on a theory, and I've heard it from a couple of other people who are studying what they see are patterns in the data, and they're also looking at the ownership of some of these companies that run the voting machines and so forth. It all seems speculative to me. I mean, I can't rule anything out, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to be easily provable, even if it is presented to a court of law. You'd actually have to show evidence of a crime. What she's alleging is a crime. So that would obviously take significant proof and development of evidence. And I don't know that that's going to be something they can even do, even if it did happen. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that it did. I don't know that they're going to be able to do that in the time they have left before states certify their votes. Giuliani's accusations seemed to hang together a little better, and they seemed a little more credible to me because I think they are the kind of errors, or in his estimation, deliberate interference with the election that you would expect in mass mail-in voting. There's no civilized country that does an election through mass mail-in voting, and the reason is, as Jimmy Carter said in 2005, absentee ballots are the most vulnerable to fraud. And we saw in early attempts this year to run elections through mass mail-in voting where it hadn't been done before, that roughly 1 in 4 of the ballots were rejected. Either they didn't have signatures on them, or they were sent by voters who were ineligible, or the addresses were wrong. There were all kinds of problems. You can imagine how awful it would be to try to determine the outcome of a national election if 1 out of every 4 ballots submitted by mail, and 2/3 of the early ballots in this election were submitted by mail, 1 out of 4 is wrong. I mean, that could swing the results in any number of states. And what Democrats did was they sued in a lot of states, I think 18 states altogether, to weaken some of the rules on absentee ballots. That made the ballots easier to accept, harder to reject. So that's probably the most plausible explanation for the rejection rate plummeting from around about 25% to well below 1%. They did it through the courts, and they were able to, in some cases, negotiate these consent decrees, which Democrats did in Georgia, for example. The consent decree in Georgia makes it almost impossible to check ballot signatures, even though you're required to do that by state law. In Georgia, the consent decree, again, which didn't go through the legislature, just went through the courts, makes it almost impossible to actually practically check the ballot signatures. So Democrats succeeded in weakening all these protections, and they then ran a turnout operation based on vote by mail. So what Giuliani describes, where ballots are not being checked properly, not being observed properly, perhaps are being included when they shouldn't be, that sounds like what you might expect, and you might expect that even through a quasi-legal process, because the Democrats were able to obtain these agreements or these judgments that allowed some of that stuff to happen. In Pennsylvania, for example, they're now supposed to accept ballots that are received even without postmarks. So there's no guarantee they even went through the mail. Somebody might have just put it in a box somewhere. They didn't mail it in. So there are all these safeguards that have been dropped. So Giuliani's claims, he's alleging a little bit more than I'm stating. He's saying that there were deliberate violations of the rules. Another claim the campaign is making is that the rules as adopted were invalid and unconstitutional, which I think is actually a good argument. So Giuliani's allegations hang together a little bit better for me. Sidney Powell is out there talking about an issue that is going to be difficult to prove. I think even if she has evidence, how do you develop a case that is so complicated? And it's on the level of Democrats saying that Russians interfered in the election. It's not impossible that they interfered. We know that Russians may have been involved in some of the hacking of DNC emails, for example, earlier in the 2016 campaign. But what she's saying is exactly the kind of things Democrats and the media did say for 4 years almost, but that doesn't make it true. So I find her allegations a little harder to believe. I'm sure she believes them. She seemed to deliver them with a lot of passion. But as Giuliani pointed out also in a moment in the press conference, the allegation that the election was improperly decided doesn't hang on Sidney Powell's allegation that Giuliani's case is independent. And in his view, it's sufficient. So the Sidney Powell allegations are not necessary for the Trump campaign to make its case. Again, this is a very, very hard case to win. It's going to require the Trump campaign to win in a number of states. That's kind of like hitting the trifecta in horse racing. You don't just have to guess the winner, but you have to guess the winner, second place, and third place. That's the kind of task they've set for themselves. So I think simply because they have to overturn results in so many places, the Trump campaign has a very low chance of succeeding. However, the case is coherent. I mean, they have a theory as to how this happened. Part of it is plausible, and I think they helped themselves by making it yesterday, although the media, of course, are only focusing on the parts of the case they find least plausible.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.